So I'd like to wager many of you clicking on this video have seen this photo before. This photo was the culmination of anti-spacecraft interception techniques from a program known as Project Mudflap and Nike Zeus. Alright, yeah, we gotta get someone new in here to name these projects, that's just atrocious. Anyways, back to the F-15. This test launch was designed to take out an orbital solar observatory, don't say that 3 times fast, the Solwind. Solwind was since decommissioned and in low Earth orbit, and we wanted to blow it to pieces to test these missiles. So, what exactly did we learn besides that we can waste millions of taxpayer dollars in probably the most awesome way possible? If I were a betting man, I'd bet that we learned aircraft aren't the best tool for anti-satellite intercept. It got replaced with a ground-based system, and even if we wanted to test more ASAT weapons, the fun police, aka US Congress, don't want us doing space-based weapons testing. Does this mean that ASAT weapons just don't exist? Well, of course not. Also in real life, it's probably more practical to have a fully developed surface-launched satellite interception missile rather than relying on an aircraft. As fascinating as the project was, modifying F-15s to carry anti-satellite missiles was not the best way to use America's comically overbloated defense budget. So I guess the reason this video exists is because real life is a little bit dull sometimes. Because of things such as not wanting to start a nuclear conflict accidentally, we can't do fun things such as shooting down low-orbiting satellites with airplanes. And just in case, we could, for some reason, shoot at satellites with aircraft and cause a cataclysmic world-ending array of anti-satellite attacks, making Kessler Syndrome look like a joke with how much space debris would exist, we still probably wouldn't choose to do so with an airplane. Multi-stage rockets are a thing that exists, and they can usually be deployed for an anti-satellite intercept much faster than a fighter jet can, at least if they're on standby. Therefore, it's far more strategically minded to employ the use of a surface-launched missile instead. Realistically, using an airplane to shoot it down seems sort of like the bottom of the barrel for possibilities here. From what I was able to find online, there's already a decent array of anti-satellite missiles, such as India's tests and China's successful 2007 anti-satellite intercept mission, as well as the Soviets developing a killer satellite system back in the day. It's very difficult to find a reason to justify using specifically aircraft in this scenario. Real life is sometimes kind of disappointing. Instead of getting these cool satellite interceptor aircraft, we're left with an admittedly fascinating, but not as fun answer to our problem. Because, airplanes are cool. And this sounds like something that would come straight out of Top Gun or Ace Combat. So what if instead we just simulated the results? Instead of trying to be as practical as possible and realistic, what would happen if the program was fully developed and a purpose-built anti-satellite interceptor aircraft was someday built? Well, in my mind, it would probably look something like this. Meet the FH-21 Phoenix. This aircraft is capable of intercepting satellites as well as functioning as a long-range air-to-air interceptor. Its wide range of capabilities is attributed to its heavyweight design, large radar, and high top speed. Imagine just about everything the F-15A was designed for, but more. More air displacement, faster, and more expensive. Waiter, more wave drag, please. I custom designed everything on this aircraft, from the spill doors on the ramp inlets to the Wish.com MFD panels I shamelessly copied from my other aircraft, using everyone's favorite aircraft simulator, Flyout. By everyone, I mean all 5 people who play the game. This is just about the best tool I'll actually have for visualizing the design process. I think you could tell by my other videos that I like the game. But before I do any of that, and go over any of those limitations, what explicitly makes my aircraft an anti-satellite interceptor? Well, for starters, we're not just building the airplane either. We're going to build an airplane and a specialized anti-satellite missile that will go on the aircraft. Since Flyout at the moment can't really simulate realistic missiles, we're going to be using fun tools such as math and real-life rocket motors as references. And in doing so, we'll also find how versatile this anti-satellite missile can actually be, and what targets it could potentially intercept. But in order to do that, we need to figure out what we're solving in the first place, so without further ado, let's move on to the problem. In order to make this aircraft an effective anti-satellite interceptor, I need to introduce to you guys a problem. The problem of orbital altitudes and, of course, delta V. If you've played, I don't know, Kerbal Space Program, or know anything about rocketry, or just general impulse versus mass, you probably know that delta V is a fancy term for how far a rocket can go without running out of fuel. Now, in a, let's say, perfect world, this math works out pretty well. All we need is starting mass, empty mass, and exhaust velocity. It gets a little bit more complicated when we factor in the 3 stages I'm building this thing with, but it's still a matter of essentially just basic addition. If you suck at arithmetic like me, it's pretty easy to write your custom calculator for this on, let's say, RStudio or Python, or just find an online calculator. The problem is, we can't really use that value for our maximum range because we don't live in a perfect world. We can't just measure how far the rocket can go and say, well guys, that's the max range, because there is no feasible way that intercept would hit its target. These missiles are leading with hundreds of kilometers of convergent distance. They will need to spend some of that fuel on fine adjustments on the way up to be accurate. Having enough fuel to both make it to space and hit the satellite is pretty complicated. Typically speaking, you'd need a pretty big rocket to do so. Now the ASM-135, the missile used in the F-15 test, was a fantastic missile, don't get me wrong, but it was limited because of this. Due to engine performance, carry weight, and wing area of the F-15, it had a severe size and weight limitation, so the F-15 could actually conduct its zoom climb properly. However, since the F-15 launch system was in fact an air launch, the rocket could be much smaller than a traditional ground launch system, so this wasn't that much of a problem for the Solwind intercept. However, that being said, it could still only intercept satellites that would be in low Earth orbit. Nowhere close to, let's say, a geosynchronous satellite, or any satellite above a very low Earth orbit for that matter. So while designing it, I needed to figure out how to solve this. Not only did it need to climb higher and faster than the F-15, you know, the plane famous for setting 8 time to climb records, but it also needed to be able to carry a heavier payload than the F-15. You know, the plane famous for being called a flying tennis court. So realistically, this thing's teetering on the edge of what a fighter can even be. Larger than the F-15 is hard to do, and earned this thing its FH designation for Fighter Type Heavy. So let's take a closer look at the airframe I just designed. So here's a drawing of my plane, the FH-21 Phoenix. You can see some odd design choices on the aircraft, such as the cut root extension for the leading edge. This originally extended to the front of the craft, but provided far too much lift, leading to instability. Hence, the unique wing shape was created to address this issue. Some quick stats. The original prototype could fly at Mach 3.1, but due to fuel concerns and SFC requirements for more extended range, the production model's top speed was reduced to only Mach 2.75, which it could sustain for nearly 20 minutes. To achieve this sheer thrust, the aircraft uses supersonic optimized engines and large variable exhaust feathers to handle the heat of the afterburners. Without boring you guys to death with the details while looking at my blueprint screen, let's jump straight into the time-lapse to show some of the aircraft's finer features. We started by creating the initial power plant for the airframe. While starting with a power plant isn't particularly good practice when you're unsure of what exactly your airplane will need, it was my starting point regardless. We used a relatively low compression ratio turbine, only having an overall compression ratio at static of around 15. Now you might ask me, why have a low compression ratio? Isn't a higher compression ratio better for efficient thrust? And for that, we need to understand speed regimes and how to design a turbine engine for them. When I build my turbines in this game, my initial thoughts are thrust and speed. What speed is the turbine designed for, and how much thrust do I want it to produce at those speeds? In an engine designed for lower speeds, you'd be correct that a higher compression ratio is more efficient. A higher compression ratio means more air in the combustion chamber, and higher exit pressure means more mechanical energy and thrust. However, when dealing with a higher speed aircraft, heat becomes a concern. With more static compression comes more friction, and with more friction comes more heat. So when it runs through this combustion system, the total pressure increase isn't really that much because the air entering is already hot. The total difference in temperature before and after combustion isn't that much anymore. So what if we look for a solution outside of the engine? What if instead we relied on inlets for compression? By using a low compression turbine and using both ram air at subsonic speeds and oblique shock generation at supersonic speeds, we can effectively increase compression as speed increases without nearly the same heat penalty. And you can observe this in real aircraft too. A subsonic passenger jet might have a compression ratio of over 30:1. But the MiG-25, a Mach 3 interceptor, barely has a compression ratio of over 4 on takeoff. Instead of reaching optimal compression at these slow speeds, these engines use their supersonic inlets for compression at high speeds. According to even the SR-71's flight manual, the aircraft only had a compression ratio of 8.8 on takeoff. If we want to fly at high supersonic speeds, the ram air itself is far more critical than the compressor, hence the domination of ramjets at just about any speed over Mach 2.5. So with a low compression ratio and a high afterburner temp, it was time to move on to the rest of the airframe. More on the intakes later. So before we move into inlet geometry, let's just spend a few minutes talking about the airframe and comparing it to the closest thing we have to a comparable aircraft, the F-15A used for the original satellite intercepts. The F-15 was an ideal aircraft for a few select reasons. Number 1, thrust. As mentioned before, the F-15 broke 8 time-to-climb records. The F-15 produced more thrust than most aircraft at the time, topping out well above Mach 2. The high thrust weight and high top speed resulted in a fantastic zoom climb, allowing a potential ASAT launch to gain energy and speed faster than with any counterpart aircraft. Also, its high wing area and nimble fighter airframe allowed for very high max takeoff weight as well as the agility to actually enter and exit that zoom climb in the first place, meaning the weight requirements of that ASAT missile could be more lenient. In terms of air-to-air, the F-15 was a well-known demon. Its high thrust to weight, high top speed, heavy armament capabilities, gigantic radome, and fantastic EW suite allowed it to become a competitive and practical fighter aircraft, providing necessary combat air patrol to various American conflicts. Since this thing was designed to practically be a successor to the F-15A's ASAT capabilities, I figured it would only make sense for it to fill the same role as the original F-15, even if it wouldn't make any sense to replace it. The initial design was a highly swept-back aircraft with an incredibly large radome. Radome? I don't know. The airframe itself was also sure to contain all the necessary space for a generous electronics warfare suite, and ample area underneath the main wing for the ASAT pylon. This centerline pylon would also be capable of carrying a conformal fuel tank and 2 large air-to-air missiles with almost no practical restriction on size and weight. However, this very swept-back design did have some drawbacks. To manage the heat and structural integrity while sustaining speeds over Mach 2.75, the airframe ditched the traditional bubble cockpit. Instead, it opted for a highly swept canopy with all the necessary framing for heat management and pressure management during high-speed flight. All of this resulted in significantly less visibility than the traditional F-15A and the inability to see the runway on landings. This second part was a pretty big problem, and was a big problem for a lot of supersonic aircraft. I imagine a landing camera would solve this, so I modeled one on the aircraft's rear landing gear opposite to the landing lights. There would be no dedicated display inside the cockpit for this camera. Instead, one of the 5 multifunction displays inside the cockpit would probably be capable of displaying it on landing. The last airframe element before beautifying the plane was the inlets, which featured variable geometry ramps. Essentially, these inlets use oblique shock generation to slow the air to subsonic speeds before entering the jet engine. This helps prevent the compressor blades from stalling and generates extra pressure inside the inlet due to the air traveling at a slower speed, sorta like, I guess, a traffic jam on a highway. I have no clue what it is, but traffic is like the most consistent way I've been able to understand like aerodynamic interactions. People on the highway just really do a good job of acting like air particles. Especially in America, where a single merge on the right side of the highway can cause turbulent traffic in all 4 lanes. What quality control measurements do you use to ensure minimum turbine vibration and ideal oblique shock generation? I eyeballed it. Yeah, I'll be honest, I sort of eyeballed the actual inlet, but I hopped on a handy-dandy oblique shock calculator to ensure I wasn't directing the overpressure directly into the compressor like an idiot. Otherwise, with the inclusion of adjustable ramps that change angle based on Mach number, as well as inlet flaps on the bottom which close at supersonic speeds, our inlet was done and specifically designed to generate ideal compression with minimal friction, an essential aspect mentioned earlier on in the video. Finally, we put a simple two-tone livery on the plane, including the roundels from everyone's favorite corrupt imperialist warmonger nation, the UFB. Not for any lore reason, I'm not doing any world building in this video, but just because I think airplanes look kinda naked without roundels. At least airplanes like this. After painstakingly painting each panel line in a little bit of weathering for realism, and stealing the entire cockpit from an old Build-A-Man because I'm lazy, it was time to fly this thing out. The test flight portion of this video will be slightly different than my previous videos, and I'm excited to see what you guys think. So, without further ado, let's get this show on the road. Alright everybody, we are actually here live. I'm recording this live because I'm going to be going through the full intercept process with, just doing it live to show you guys how the actual satellite intercept would work, so apologies if this sounds a little bit different than usual. I'll also have, Invisible 80s cameraman, who's going to be following us around and providing some really cool VHS transitions and shots of the plane while it flies. I did some math on the rocket motor itself, so combined with our now increased intercept altitude, as well as the almost 4-ton missile we have right here, our delta V is actually a lot higher, and I'd imagine this thing can intercept at a maximum altitude of over 1,000 kilometers by comparison to the original, which was a little bit lower. So, anyways, without further ado, let's turn our avionics on here and close the canopy. Luckily, we do in fact have a perfect headwind, so it's not going to be very much of a problem for takeoff, but let's configure this thing for climb anyway. So pitch trim of -0.10. There's no point in holding the parking brake for like a short field or anything. This thing generates so much thrust, it's just, you get off the ground immediately. Throttling up. And rotation, positive rate, gear up. Neutral on the controls, let the pitch trim take care of it, because once we get to right around Mach 0.8, I believe it'll start just putting us automatically on a pretty steep climb here, so. Yeah, takeoff process is pretty easy in this thing, especially because it does have a full fly-by-wire suite for the intercept program, so. Under regular flight, it doesn't need it, but due to like the absolute insane altitude of the zoom climb, as well as just inertial coupling and a few other issues, it has a pretty restrictive fly-by-wire for the satellite intercept. Holy crap, does this thing climb well as well. Even with that over 4-ton missile on the bottom, we're achieving like 250, we're probably gonna hit 250 meters a second here, honestly, on this climb. No, we're evening out at right around 234. We are going to flip over and level out just as we hit 10,000 here, though, so. Alright, pitch trim neutral. Level ourselves out, and put on the autopilot, because I'm lazy. Alright, we are now hands off. In real life, it probably wouldn't actually matter that much, the distance of the flight, because you don't need to... What's the word I'm looking for? The missile itself is going to travel towards the target. You're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of kilometers of convergent distance. A slight difference in position of launch really doesn't matter that much. What does matter a lot more, however, is the timing. So as long as you're in the general right area, it's a lot more important for you to get your timing within, you know, a minute or so of the projected launch window if you really want it to be able to intercept the target. Because your target's going to be moving at multiple kilometers a second. What's an Earth orbit? It's like 8 kilometers a second or so. So we can't afford to miscalculate the timing in any way. We don't have an actual satellite to intercept, and this missile doesn't actually work. We just did the math based on real stats. And oh look, you can see the ramp inlets closing and the spill doors closed on the bottom too. But that is about it. I'm actually probably just going to enter the zoom climb immediately here. I don't want to keep everyone waiting. But let's wait until we get to about Mach 2.2 before entering it. Alright, now this will come real quick, so disengage autopilot and nose up. The fly-by-wire is going to hold it in a straight line, so I don't need to worry about that. There's 70 degrees, so we're climbing nearly straight up at Mach 2. And once we hit 20 kilometers, we release that missile. There it is, missile releases, and does absolutely nothing and falls back down to the Earth. But that's fine. Bye, missile. Whee! That looks so dumb. Anyways, at this point, we can pull some really steep AOA trying to get out of this climb because there's basically no air up here. At the altitudes of this intercept, I'd imagine that there's well less than 1/4 of an atmosphere of total air density. Maybe like less than even 20% or so. And turn throttle back to idle cutoff because our engines just stalled. Gotta admit, it's kind of sketchy doing an intercept where your engines literally stall in the middle of it, but we'll be able to descend and turn them back on. That's going to have to be part of this whole intercept process, unfortunately. There we go. Now we're starting to feel the effects of that air a little bit more. We're starting to pull some more Gs. A little bit more positive rate as we pull out of this descent now. Luckily, our descent profile made a perfect split S back to the airfield, so now all I have to do is descend a little bit so we can turn the engines back on, and then we can just cruise back pretty peacefully. There we go, there's engines. Perfect. We'll keep this altitude in a cruise speed of about Mach 1.5 on our way back. This thing can super cruise up to just about Mach 1.7, but it's probably less efficient to do so, so I'm going to keep it at a nice, calm, gentle Mach 1.5. Well, I guess at least as calm and gentle as Mach 1.5 can really be. Either way, I think at this point I'm probably just going to fly myself back. I'll skip ahead to the landing process since it's probably a little bit more interesting than just watching me cruise all the way. I'll enjoy my time with 80s cameraman here, talk about current events and all that stuff while waiting for you guys to return. Although I do wish he'd turn down that particularly loud retrowave music. Alright, see you guys when I see ya. Alright, we've intercepted our fictional ILS system here, and we're on a nice long approach leg. Ideal approach angle of attack in this thing is about like 6 or 7 degrees, so I'm just going to go ahead, throw the air brake on, and see what it does. That's right around 6 degrees, perfect. Alright, runway's in sight. We'll be landing on the left runway. What is it, like 3-5 left here? Gear down. full landing configuration now, so we're just gonna use the throttle management to keep our glide slope, hopefully, perfect for landing. Now, I don't have a lot of experience landing this thing. This is actually my first time trying. So, pardon me if it doesn't go perfectly. You know, you'd think I'd be smart enough to do a landing approach practice 1 or 2 times before live streaming it, but I did not think that far ahead, as you can tell. I'm not going to be doing this landing in first person because obviously the landing camera, as mentioned before, doesn't actually exist in the game. So, otherwise I absolutely would do this first person. There we go. Gonna start my flare a little bit early here because this thing loves to ride in the ground effect, and... oh my goodness, yeah, look at that. Look at that ground effect. Alright, we're on the ground though. And slow down as fast as possible because this thing doesn't like to stop. There we go, that was relatively smooth. I wasn't expecting it to glide down the runway so much because of the ground effect, but... alright, I'm gonna cut off Live Messier right here because the outro is gonna take another 5 minutes otherwise while he taxis all the way back to the hangars. If you guys enjoyed the video, thanks. I'm not gonna ask you to do anything about it though. This plane will be available for download in my Discord server as well as the Flyout Discord server, so join one of those two if you actually want to fly this thing. I also now need to use my outro time to thank my Patreon fans. It's $3 an hour for the base tier and you get early access to planes like these, so if you're interested in flying these or interested in the other few benefits they provide, head on down to the Patreon. Thank you so much to those supporting me, and of course thank you to anyone who had the patience to watch this all the way to the end of the video. And of course let me know what you think if I should be doing more of these very long, drawn out flight portions of the video, if it's a little bit more interesting. Or I guess a little bit more substance so you can get a better feel for the plane than, let's say, my typical montage. Or maybe a little bit of both. I was sort of trying to do that with our invisible 80s cameraman here, but he can be hard to work with at times. Especially because a replay system doesn't exist in Flyout, so I literally had to like follow the exact same path as my first flight and just record it and pretend and overlay it. So because of this, 80s cameraman isn't exactly the friendliest character to work with. But I'm gonna stop rambling. Thanks for watching, y'all. I'll see you in the next one. See ya!